Well, as I said, it's a great delight to be with you this morning. It's a particular delight to be able to work with you through this next section of John's Gospel. And as we've just heard, this is a section that very much focuses on the temple at Jerusalem and what happened there on a particular occasion when Jesus visited. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem today is very much a contested space. It's a holy site for Jews because it is the place that God chose as the dwelling place for his name. It is the place where God chose to dwell on earth. And various iterations of God's temple stood on that site for almost 1,000 years. But today it's also a holy site for Islam. For more than 1,300 years, the Dome of the Rock sits there at the centre of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and obviously I think it's the third most holy site in Islam. Tensions were at flashpoint just this week when certain Israeli politicians were proposing restrictions to access to the Dome of the Rock during Ramadan because of the situation. And if you're worried about this, no, I'm not going to say anything about the geopolitical situation in Israel and Gaza in the sermon this morning. But I do want to reflect on the significance of that location for Christians today. So acknowledging that it has significance for both Jews and Muslims, my question is, what is the significance that we should attach to that particular location today? I want to suggest that John 2 is really important for understanding the ongoing significance of the temple for us, God's temple, that is. So let's dive into the passage. It begins in verse 13, where we're told that Jesus has gone up to Jerusalem at Passover time. Passover was one of 3 annual pilgrimage festivals. In the Old Testament, Exodus 32, it says, 3 times a year all your men shall go up to Jerusalem to appear before the sovereign Lord. And Passover was one of those 3, in fact, the most important of those 3. Passover, as you probably know, commemorates what God did in saving his people from their slavery in Egypt through the sacrifice of a Passover lamb. When Jesus arrives in Jerusalem for the festival, we're told in verse 14 that in the temple he found there those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and the money changers sitting there. This is very similar to another incident that's recorded, but one that occurs at the other end of Jesus' ministry. This event is occurring pretty close to the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, whereas the other event occurs probably 3 years later at the end. It comes after his entry into Jerusalem for the final time, where he's riding on a donkey and the crowds are there waving the palm branches, the thing that we celebrate on Palm Sunday. And although there are obvious similarities between those 2 incidents, it's important not to conflate the 2 of them together. And in fact, as a preacher, it's very tempting to do this, which is to preach John 2 through the lens of these other passages. But I want to make the point that the focus of that final cleansing of the temple, which we read about in Matthew 21, Mark 11, and Luke 19, is actually a very different focus. There, the focus is on both the Gentiles and the Jewish leaders. In the other passage, the point is the temple was supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations, and what they were doing, selling in the temple courts, was taking away the place where the Gentiles could come and approach God. And it was the Jewish leaders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, who have done that. They've turned God's house into a den of robbers. That's the focus of those other accounts in, as I said, Matthew 21, Mark 11, Luke 19. That final cleansing of the temple is actually a symbolic judgment against the leaders of Israel. I'm not preaching that passage this morning, but that's what its purpose is in the flow of that narrative. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus symbolically curses a fig tree because it wasn't producing fruit. Then he goes into the temple, and it's the Israel religion is not producing fruit. That's the point. The focus is actually a symbolic act of judgment. My point is that this account in John 2, even though it's the same kind of thing, Jesus driving out, the point of it is actually very different. The focus is not on Gentiles, they're not mentioned at all. The focus is not even really on the Jewish leaders, they're kind of there but in the background. The purpose of this story, it's actually all about Jesus. It's actually saying something about Jesus and telling us his purpose. We're told that the temple, in his words, is my Father's house. It's Jesus' authority that is in question here. Show us a sign to prove your authority to do these things. It's zeal for God's house that consumes Jesus. The purpose of this story in John's Gospel is a pointer to Jesus. So let's read John 2 on its own terms rather than, as I'm tempted to do, read it through the lens of those other stories. Verse 14 refers to two groups of people, the merchants and the money changers. The merchants were there to sell animals, in particular cattle, sheep and doves, and their significance is because they are for sacrifice in the temple. They're part of the things which are prescribed as part of the Old Testament sacrificial rituals. Remember why everybody is here? These are pilgrimage festivals. People have come up to Jerusalem from all over the land in order to offer sacrifices. It's kind of impractical to drag your sheep all the way from Galilee to Jerusalem, and so those who had travelled long distance needed to buy animals to sacrifice when they got there so that they could offer up the sacrifices prescribed by God's law. The money changers were there for a different reason. All Jewish males over the age of 20 were required to pay a temple tax, half a shekel. This required money changers because the temple had to be paid with a particular coin, the tetradrachma, which that was a special kind of religiously commissioned coin, and so you needed to change your local currency for the special currency. My point is that there was a kind of religious justification for both the merchants and the money changers. They were both enabling sacrifices or enabling the payment of the temple tax. So why does Jesus get so mad? And I think we do have to realise that this is like he's got a whip and he's overturning tables. This is not just kind of politely, if you don't mind, if you could perhaps move those to the one side. No, Jesus is forcefully removing these people from the temple. It's not probably because of what we infer from the other accounts. Remember the Matthew 21, Mark 11, that the money changers were price gouging. You've turned this place into a den of robbers. That's not in John's account. Nor is it because they've stolen it from the Gentiles. It's a house of prayer for all nations. That's not mentioned here. What is significant, the offence to Jesus, is because of what they have done to my Father's house. Not just God's house, but my Father's house. Jesus is both focusing on the temple itself and its significance and his relationship to the temple. I want to drill down on that idea for just a moment to make sense of why this is such a big deal. To make sense of this, we've actually got to wind back a little bit and think about what is the significance of the temple in Jerusalem being God's house. The story of the temple starts with King David. Back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, David takes it into his head to say, I'm going to build a house for God. And God sends him a message through a prophet to say, no, you're not going to build a house for me, I'm going to build a house for you. It's a word play on the house. You're not going to build a building, a house for me, a temple. I'm going to build a house, a dynasty for you. And it's the first part of that dynasty, your son, a son of David. He's the one who's going to build a house, a temple for me. And that's what happened. David's son Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem around about 960 BC. And when Solomon finished building that house, the glory of the Lord descended upon it. And thereafter, the temple in Jerusalem was the place on earth where God dwelt in the midst of his people. It was the focal point of God's presence on earth. The temple in Jerusalem, if you like, was the meeting place between heaven and earth. When you needed to do business with God, you went to the temple. It was the place where, and the only place where sacrifices for sin were meant to be offered. The priests in the temple acted as intermediaries between God and people. You went to the temple to pray. And if you lived in Galilee or somewhere and that was inconvenient every time you wanted to pray, you would at least pray towards Jerusalem and to particularly the temple, because that was symbolically the place where God was on earth. It was the place where God's law went out from. God's instruction came forth from the temple. There was no other place on earth that was more important than the temple in Jerusalem if you were a Jew. And yet there was a paradox about the temple. The paradox is that the temple is both the place of access to God and yet at the same time a reminder of our separation from God. That was because of the way the temple was set up with concentric holy zones. The outermost zone was the court of the Gentiles. So if you were a Gentile and you wanted to come and pray, you could come into, it wasn't inside the building, but inside the outermost gate, the court of the Gentiles, you could draw near to God. But if you were a Gentile, you could only come there and no further. Next ring in was the court of women, which was for Jewish men and women particularly, but women could enter there, but go no further. The next court was the court of Israel, where Jewish males could enter in, but they could go no further. You're still not even in the building yet. The only people who could actually get into the building were the priests. They could go into the holy place. And so, and that's because as you get further and further in, you're getting closer and closer to the dwelling place of God. But right at the very heart of the temple was the most holy place. That contained the Ark of the Covenant, so the box containing the copy of the Ten Commandments, not the copy, the Ten Commandments. And there was only one person once a year who was allowed to go into the most holy place, the high priest on the Day of Atonement, to offer a very special sacrifice. So there's the paradox. This is the place of access to God, and yet there's all these barriers around it, so you can't get close to God. Like the message is, come close, but not too close. God dwells in the midst of his people, and yet paradoxically also remains at a distance, because it's not safe for sinful people to come into the presence of a holy God. Now, that temple built by Solomon was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC because of the repeated and unrepentant sin of God's people. Time and time again, God promised his people that, no, turn back to me. And they said, no, it doesn't matter. We've got the temple of God. We've got the God of all the heavens is dwelling in our midst. Nothing can touch us because our God is here in Jerusalem. And eventually God's judgment fell. For 70 years, the temple lay in ruins, and for that generation, the destruction of the temple signified God's absence. There was no place to meet with God, no place to offer sacrifices, no focal point for prayer and instruction. After 70 years, that temple was rebuilt by Zerubbabel, who was a descendant of King David. A bit like Solomon, he was a temple-building son of David. The temple that we're talking about in John 2 was a heavily renovated version of that second temple. So the first temple in Jerusalem, Solomon, second temple, Zerubbabel. It's still the second temple period by the time we get to Jesus, although it's undergone a very, very significant renovation that started in 20 BC. Herod the Great took 46 years to reconstruct it, and they doubled the size of the Temple Mount and expanded the courts and clad the whole thing in white stone. In fact, this is referred to in our passage in verse 20 when it says it's taken 46 years to build this temple. It's actually 46 years to renovate this temple. Okay, now with all that background in mind, let's come back to John 2 and see what's significant about what's going on here. Jesus is driven out, the merchants and the money changers, because they have corrupted the purpose of the temple. They have turned God's house, the place that Jesus calls my Father's house, into a house of trade. It's no longer the place where people are going to draw near to God as close as they possibly can, because it's just become a religious institution. Jesus' response is offence at what they have done to his Father's house. The disciples see what's happening and they recall the words of Psalm 69 verse 9, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Jesus is all fired up, to use that kind of language. He's driven by a desire to see God's house used for its proper purposes so that people can draw near to God in repentance and prayer. Now, those who are present challenge Jesus, kind of, by what authority do you do this? And he says, they say, verse 18, "What sign can you show to prove your authority to do all this?" Now, note that sign language. You've already met it once before last week, and you'll see this woven through certainly the first part of John's Gospel. There are 7 signs. I hope I'm not giving something away that you haven't already been told before. But in a sense, what we're being told here is that there's actually another sign to look out for that's going to come right at the very end of the gospel, because Jesus is going to say his own resurrection is the final and most climactic sign, and we'll talk about the significance of that at the end. Jesus says, in response to their question, what authority? By what authority? What sign can you show us? They say something that I'm sure must have dumbfounded those who were listening. He says, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up again in 3 days." Now, I'm sure they couldn't have understood what he was talking about, because not unreasonably, if Jesus says destroy this temple, they are probably thinking of the building around them. That would be the natural thing to hear of Jesus' words. It's only us, the readers, who get the kind of editorial explanation in verse 21. The temple of which he spoke was his body. So whether or not the Jewish leaders who were listening understood what was going on, let's unpack the significance of what Jesus is saying. So what Jesus is saying is destroy this body. Suddenly he's made some inexplicable shift that he thinks that he himself is the temple of God, and destroying him and raising it up in 3 days, that's going to be the sign for his authority to cleanse what's going on. That's the logic of what Jesus has just said. How does that even make sense? Well, we need to back up and realise that John's Gospel has actually already begun to prepare us for this idea, although we may have missed it at the time. Because Jesus is saying, what Jesus is claiming here is that he is taking over the functions of that temple in Jerusalem. He is the replacement temple. John's Gospel, as I said, prepares us for that claim back in chapter 1. It says in the middle of chapter 1 that Jesus is the Word who became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The dwelling word there, it's literally he tabernacled amongst us, so he templed in our midst. It's the language that you used to use of talking about God dwelling in the midst of his people. John 1 is saying Jesus has come in order to be the temple of God with us. Previously, you went to the temple in Jerusalem if you wanted to meet with God. Jesus is now the place where you meet God. You don't meet him in the temple in Jerusalem. That's why John 1 goes on to say, we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only. Previously, you went to the temple at Jerusalem because that was where God had chosen as the dwelling place of his glory. Jesus is where you now see the glory of God. The point is that it's Jesus and not the temple that becomes the place of sacrifice for sin. And that's why Jesus will say, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will rebuild it. Remember I said that the first temple got destroyed in 586 BC? That destruction of the temple was God's cataclysmic judgment on sin of the people of that day. As we move forward in the story of John's Gospel, there's going to come another day, it turns out to be AD 33, an even blacker day in history, an even more cataclysmic judgment on sin when God destroys a temple again, except that this temple that he's destroying is actually the body of his own Son, the ultimate dwelling place of God. He's going to destroy that temple as a judgment on sin in the same way that the first destruction of the temple was a judgment. Only to rebuild it again in 3 days. That is, on Easter Sunday, when Christ bursts forth from the tomb, God's dwelling place with mankind will be rebuilt, and it will be rebuilt never to be destroyed again. This is a permanent and full replacement of the temple in Jerusalem. That's what we're learning about Jesus in John chapter 2. That's why this is so important for understanding what's going to happen at the other end of Jesus' ministry. The ultimate sign of who Jesus is in the resurrection from the dead. This is God rebuilding the dwelling place between God and his people. So, what are the implications of all of this? Well, it means that we should not be expecting a replacement temple in Jerusalem. There's no theological significance for Christians of the physical temple in Jerusalem anymore. It also means that we shouldn't, as Christians, use temple imagery to describe what we do in church. Like in the Old Testament, you went to a holy place, you had intermediaries called priests to introduce you to God. Matt and I are not priests in that sense of the word. We are not intermediaries between you and God. You don't need to come to this building in order to do business with God. You don't come to a place anymore, you come to a person. The message of the old temple was, come close, but not too close. It's dangerous to get close to God. The message now is draw near with full assurance of faith. There is no stand back. There's no limited access to the holy place. We all have unmediated access to the holy place, which is the Holy One, Jesus. Since Jesus is the new temple, it means that he is the way and the only way for us to draw near to the Father. Now, the disciples evidently didn't grasp all of the significance of what Jesus said, and I'm sure I wouldn't. I'm sure none of us would have understood what he was getting at the time. But in verse 22, we get this little hint. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scriptures and the words that Jesus had spoken. It was only then that they kind of joined the dots and said, okay, I kind of get the connection. God has promised to dwell in our midst. The temple destruction is a judgment on sin. Jesus dies bearing the sins of the world. He is a destructed temple, but hey, God raised it up again in 3 days. That's what Jesus was talking about 3 years ago. That they believed the scriptures, but more importantly, they believed the word of Jesus. That his resurrection would be the ultimate sign of his authority to do these things, because that was the sign that God has forever built his dwelling place amongst us. So let me finish this morning by asking us the obvious questions that come out of this passage for us. If this is who Jesus is, he is the dwelling place between God and man. He is the place where you meet with God. Have you come to the place where God dwells in our midst? Have you come to Jesus as the one to deal with your sin, my sin, where you can learn God's word and respond to him in obedience, that he is the one that we pray to and through? Have you recognised Jesus as your mediator, the one who stands between you and God, and come to God through him?